How long do you think it would take for America to run out of oil if the Strait of Hormuz were shut down tonight? 6 months, 3 months? The real answer will keep you up at night. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the thing we have always proudly called our last line of defense, can only cover part of the shortfall for fewer than 90 days. And during those 90 days, everything from gas prices to food prices, from the stock market to your retirement savings, will change in ways none of us are prepared to face. More importantly, this is no longer a hypothetical question. Hormuz is closed, right now as you read this. And the clock is ticking. Welcome to Mysteries of Simple Things, the channel where everyday secrets are uncovered and explained. To understand why what is happening right now is dangerous enough for the head of the International Energy Agency to call it the greatest energy security challenge in the history of humanity, we need to start with what lit the fuse. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran under an operation called Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and senior leadership. Within hours, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps began broadcasting over radio frequencies, a message that stopped the shipping world. Cold vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz were not permitted to pass, not a warning, not an empty threat, a formal order backed up by missiles and drones. And the world, which had spent decades treating Hormuz as a potential flashpoint, suddenly realized that the worst-case scenario was no longer a theory. Within 24 hours of that declaration, tanker traffic through the strait began collapsing. Maritime insurance companies pulled war risk coverage for ships attempting to transit the area. Without insurance, no ship owner was willing to risk a vessel worth hundreds of millions of dollars in a waterway where missiles and drones were active. By the first week of March, traffic through Hormuz had dropped by 90%. More than 150 ships sat anchored outside the strait, waiting hopelessly for any signal that things had changed. On March 2nd, a senior Revolutionary Guard official officially confirmed the strait was closed and threatened any ship that tried to pass anyway. Iran carried out more than 21 confirmed attacks on commercial vessels in the area. This is not a warning on paper anymore. This is reality unfolding day by day. Energy markets responded immediately. Brent crude prices jumped 10 to 13% in a single day on March 2nd, hitting around $80 to $82 a barrel. And that was just the opening days, when markets still held on to some hope that the situation would be resolved quickly. But as week 2 passed and then week 3, analysts started revising their forecasts upward. Experts estimate that without a medium-term solution in the near future, oil prices could hit $120 a barrel. And in the worst-case scenario, if the blockade stretches into summer, the number $200 is no longer unthinkable. At that price level, a gallon of gasoline in America could easily push past $8 to $10. Not in a few months, in a few weeks. Anyone who lived through the summer of 2008, when gas prices climbed toward $4.50 a gallon and the whole country was buzzing about it, understands part of that feeling. But the 2026 Hormuz crisis is nothing like 2008. Nothing like 1973 either, because this time, supply was not partially reduced. It was cut off suddenly and completely, and the scale of the shock is larger than anything the modern world has ever had to deal with. The International Energy Agency launched the largest emergency reserve release in the entire history of the organization. They had never done that before. Never. Until now. But emergency reserve releases are not an unlimited solution. And this is the part that most TV news coverage never explains clearly enough. The United States has its Strategic Petroleum Reserve, holding somewhere between 350 and 400 million barrels of oil stored in underground salt caverns in Louisiana and Texas. At a release rate of around 4 million barrels per day, that reserve can only cover part of the shortfall for fewer than 90 days. That is the number we mentioned right at the start. And that clock is running right now, not in a hypothetical scenario on some policy planner's desk, but in the real world of March 2026. Other countries are in no better shape. Japan, which depends on the Persian Gulf for about 95% of its crude oil imports, urgently asked its government to release national reserves within the very first days of the crisis. South Korea, which sources about 75% of its crude from the region, is facing the same pressure. Iraq, the world's sixth largest oil producer, was forced to cut its exports from Basra from 3.3 million barrels per day down to just 900,000 barrels because most of its oil simply cannot get out. Saudi Arabia had to shut down the Ras Tanura refinery, its largest facility, which processes 55,000 barrels per day. Energy giants, including Qatar Energy Shell and Kuwait Petroleum Corporation, have invoked force majeure clauses, something that had never happened before in the entire history of oil and gas production in the Gulf region. Never happened, not once. Until right now. To deal with the shortfall that reserves cannot cover, shipping companies are doing the only thing left available to them, sailing around the southern tip of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope. Instead of a short route through Hormuz and the Red Sea, oil tankers now have to travel thousands of additional nautical miles south, looping around the entire continent of Africa before reaching Asia or Europe. Shipping costs have surged. Delivery times have stretched by 2 to 3 weeks. And during that time, the supply chains of entire industries around the world are beginning to crack at the seams, one link at a time. But even that long detour around Africa is not entirely safe. Iran launched drone strikes against Oman's deep-water ports at Duqm and Salalah, which had been seen as backup transit points in an emergency. At least one fuel storage tank at Duqm was damaged. The Joint War Committee of the London insurance market added the entire sea area around Oman to its list of high-risk maritime zones. On top of that, Iran's Revolutionary Guard warned that if any attack is carried out against Iranian territory or its islands, they will mine every waterway across the entire Persian Gulf. That means not just Hormuz, but the entire Gulf could become a literal minefield. That is a completely different level of escalation. The impact spread faster and in more directions than most people anticipated. Europe is now facing its second energy crisis, following the one triggered by the war in Ukraine. European gas storage levels were sitting at just 30% capacity after a brutal winter in 2025 and 2026, and Qatar's halt of LNG exports through Hormuz pushed European gas prices to nearly double in just a matter of weeks. The European Central Bank was forced to postpone its planned interest rate cuts and raised its inflation forecast. Economists are warning that energy-intensive economies in Europe face a real risk of technical recession if the blockade stretches through the summer refill season. Inflation in the United Kingdom is expected to break above 5% in 2026. And what about Americans? Are you thinking this is Europe's problem or Asia's problem? Think again. Former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen has publicly warned that depending on how badly the war impacts oil markets, American economic growth will suffer, and the Fed's job of keeping inflation under control will become significantly harder. U.S. stock markets reacted from the very first days. Rising gas prices are eating into the purchasing power of American consumers. New uncertainty injected into the business environment is driving down corporate confidence, pushing companies to invest less and hire less. And the 401k accounts of tens of millions of Americans are getting painfully thinner with each trading session. You do not have to live near the Middle East to feel any of this. You just need a retirement account and a gas pump near your house. So what is Washington doing? Trump issued Iran an ultimatum demanding the strait be reopened within 48 hours. Then he pushed the deadline back 5 days. Then pushed it back again. Secretary of State Rubio is calling on G7 nations to act together to reopen the route, arguing that other countries depend on Hormuz far more than America does, and that this is everyone's shared interest. The U.S. has begun deploying thousands of additional troops to the Middle East and is looking into the possibility of U.S. Navy escorts for oil tankers attempting to transit. On March 19th, the United States launched a military campaign aimed at forcing the strait back open. But Iran holds a natural geographic advantage. The strait is narrow, the northern coastline belongs to Iran. Cheap drones and sea mines are far more effective than expensive warships when you are the one defending a tight waterway. This is not the kind of fight where America's technological superiority translates easily into a quick result. Meanwhile, on March 26th, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced that vessels owned by 5 countries, including China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan, would be permitted to transit the strait. This is a carefully calculated geopolitical move. Iran is creating a two-tier system in which friendly nations enjoy transit privileges while the West is blockaded. Bahrain is pushing at the United Nations Security Council for a resolution, authorizing all necessary means to restore freedom of navigation at Hormuz. But with China and Russia holding veto power on the Security Council, the prospects for that resolution are not encouraging. As of today, March 27, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed for nearly 4 weeks. There is no clear end in sight. Shipping analysts assess that routine commercial transit through Hormuz is unlikely to resume for the rest of 2026. That means the 90-day clock we talked about at the very beginning is no longer a metaphor. It is running for real. And every day that passes is another day the world burns through emergency reserves with no realistic way to replenish them in the short term. And here's the thing that few people are saying out loud, but everyone is thinking. Nobody knows how this ends. There is no historical precedent for a complete Hormuz blockade sustained at this scale and in this context. Every economic model, every contingency plan, every crisis simulation that governments have spent decades preparing all assumed the blockade would be short-resolved within days or weeks. Nobody actually has a plan B for a scenario that drags on for months. The next time you hear news about Hormuz, about negotiations, about ultimatums, about military operations, do not treat it as just another foreign affairs story from far away. Remember the 90 days. Remember the gas pump. Remember your retirement account. Because all of it is being decided right now, not in Washington or in Texas, but in a 21-mile strip of water on the other side of the planet, where the world is learning the most expensive lesson in the history of modern energy, that global prosperity is more fragile than we ever thought. And sometimes all it takes to shake it to its core is one small valve being twisted shut at exactly the wrong moment.